Alright, in this video, I'm actually not going to program. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the asynchronous request that is presented in the Ajax chapter. And Ajax is a really cool and a really strong tool that you want to add to your toolbox if you're going to be a web programmer. Because ultimately what it's going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to interact with a server behind the scenes without constantly reloading the page that the user is looking at. And you see this on tons of pages that update data as it goes. So the best example that the book gives is Google Maps, that a lot of server work is being done behind the scenes. Data is being retrieved without the entire page having to load each time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the Ajax example they give, because you have to have kind of an understanding of the PHP behind it. I'm going to kind of gloss over that and just talk to you through what's going on. So I'm going to start with the chapter example 14, and then I'm going to work back to the HTTP request object that is included in this somewhere. So they're including the file that they wrote in the chapter, but we're going to work backwards. What we have here is a basic form that has the user put in their username and then their email and password, I think. Yeah. And so next to each of the first two, the username availability, they actually have a button there that they're clicking to allow you to send your username in to see if it is available. And so if you were doing this without Ajax, what would happen is you would have to write a server call and then it would reload the page with the results. But what this does is allows you to make that server call behind the scenes and update the information on the fly. So let's go ahead and scroll down to see what we have down here. Attached to those two links are click events. When we click on the username link, it'll go to check username, and when we click on the other one, it'll go to check the email address. And those are both very similarly done, so we'll look at them pretty quickly. So let's just assume that we have just clicked on the check availability of username, which is going to call the check username function. So let's go take a peek at that. So here's that function. Of course, when we come into the event, we pass the event. We're going to prevent the default action of the click from going on. And what we're going to do first of all is we're going to go ahead and get the value or whatever they've typed into the text box, what we're actually going to check. So if they typed in L. Schult, which is my username, that value would be retrieved from that element and stored in our variable named user value. So if that's not filled in, if there's no value there, then we're going to alert and tell them that they need to enter a username to check before they can do that. All right. So then what we're going to do is we are going to construct some things and we're going to send them into our pre-done HTTP request function. So assuming something's typed in, what we're going to do is we're going to create a string of the URL that we're actually going to call on the server. So in this example, there's a PHP program that is provided with your book that takes the username that you entered and compares it against an array of objects. I can show you that just real quick. Hang on just a second. See if I can get that up real quickly. So this is PHP, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time working on how this works, but basically in this example, they've set out an array of username and email, and so if we were to run this, if we checked JMC Peak or if we checked P. Welton, it would return that those were already taken, and same with the email address. So they've only really populated with this with 2. In the real world, you would probably be calling a database and retrieving information from a database, but they've kind of done a quick little program to just allow you to interface with this program. So what we ultimately want to do is we want to call this, we want to send in our data, we want this to process, and then we want to get that data back out and use it in our page without, like I said, having to make a separate server call and reload the page each time. So that's what happens right here is we say, first of all, we're going to call this PHP program on our server, and we're going to tack on whatever username they have entered, because if we go back to our PHP script, what they're going to do is they're going to get the information that they need to check this array out of our URL query string. So when this is done, this would say, if in my case, it would be chapter 14 underscore from validator.php question mark username equals Elschult. And that would be sent in, that URL is going to be sent into our function that is going to handle our asynchronous request. So notice that we're going to have var request. We're going to set a new HTTP request. We're going to send in our URL we just did. And then we're also going to have the callback go to handle response. And what the callback is going to be, we'll see in a minute, is the process where the server is of making that call and any error handling that needs to be done. So we create this request, and this gets sent into our HTTP request that was included. So there's our send. We'll come back to that. So what happens is basically this URL goes in, and we tell it that when it checks the server status, that it should call a function named handle response, which is right here, and we'll look at it in a minute. So let's go look at our HTTP request. That's a separate file that you wrote in a different example if you're playing along with the book. So here's our function named HTTP request. It's going to receive a URL, and it's going to receive what function is going to handle the callback. And so we're going to set up a request using the XML HTTP request object. We're going to open that up, and we're going to tell it that we're going to use the get method instead of the post method, and that we're going to send the data using our URL that came into this function. So that PHP file with our username attached to that URL. All right, so temp request is set up. This is an internal thing. It's something that you'll see fairly often. There's not a whole lot of reason to go into it, and your book does a good reason of explaining why we're going to do that instead of this request. But we're going to set up basically a copy of this to work with. And so the purpose of this whole script right here is to handle the asynchronous part of the request. We're going to check the server, and we're going to check the server for 2 things. Because this is asynchronous, we're going to check to see what its ready state is. So the ready state is going to tell us where it is in the process. So if you remember from your chapter readings, there are statuses that go from 0 to 14, and the ready state change event will report on those when the server goes through the various stages. So it goes from the object being created, the open method being called, the request being sent with the headers received. But ultimately what we're looking for is we're looking for a status of 4, which means that the requested data has been fully received by the server. And so then the server is going to send back a status through the XHTML HTTP request object, telling us what the status of that request is. So what we're checking for here is we're checking for a status, I'm getting a little mixed up in my words. I'm getting a ready state change property return of 4, meaning that the requested data has been fully received. And then we're getting a server status back of 200, meaning that the data has been sent and there were no errors. So these are server errors, so like a 404 not found, a 500 forbidden, and things like that. So in this case, if the server's done with its work and it comes back with no errors, then go ahead and use the callback function, which is in our other page, and we'll send back the response text. Else we'll go ahead and handle errors. So this will handle the changes in the status, and then we go back to our, not our PHP page, and the send is created. So when the data comes back to us, this is the callback that was referred to in the HTTP request module. So it calls the function handle response, and it receives the response text that was returned by the function, by the URL. So it returns the results of the PHP. But of course, that a lot of times is going to come back as an object, and you can only send text. So this is where your JSON comes in from earlier, and you're going to go ahead and automatically have JSON parse that response text. And that's all it does, and it's stored in the response. And so if it responded from that PHP program that it was available, then it gives you the result that that search term is available. And if it didn't come back with a response of available, it handles errors and tells you that that's not available. So that's kind of a quick overview of how an asynchronous request works. You call, a lot of times you'll have this because you're going to use it for almost all of, a lot of your things. It's very generic. You send in the URL and the callback depending on what functionality you're looking for. I could be calling a completely different PHP file, and all I have to do is send that URL in, and the response could be handled in 100 different ways and different pages. And so that's why I get to send in which function is going to handle my callback as well. And so that's a general overview of a straightforward request to a server file. This PHP actually does the checking of whether the username is in this array or the email is in this array. It sends back a value of available or not available. That's received here after the server is finished with its work and no errors were reported. And what it does then is it calls the callback function, sending the response from the server, and then that's where the server receives that in a JSON format. It parses any JSON text, particularly if you're receiving multiple items back from the server, and then it goes on and programs whatever the functionality of this is to tell it if it's available or not. So that's just a quick overview. Again, like I said, I'm not going to program because it requires a little bit of understanding of PHP if I want to show you what our program's doing. So since this one's presented in the book, that should give you an overview of how it works. And you're not limited to PHP. If you've taken other programming classes and you've used ASP or something like that, Ajax works with a lot of those server-side programming languages, and generally speaking will interface with them and transfer information using the JSON method.